Hey youth, this week we're continuing the storyline of the Bible. We're glad you're here. Let's get started. We're going through this series to help you understand what the Bible is all about. Now, it can be tough to understand the Bible. I mean, it's a really big book. Reading the Bible is more intimidating than telling your grandma to stop commenting on all your Facebook statuses. No, grandma, I do love you. No, it's not cool anymore. No, But the Bible is God's story to us, and we want you to understand how it fits into your lives. Last week, we looked at the first part of the Old Testament and saw how God created us to be in a relationship with Him. This week, we're going to finish the Old Testament by summarizing the books Joshua through Esther. Now, this is a period of 1,000 years. That's a really long time. I mean, think of how much has changed in 1,000 years. The Americas were discovered, the internet was invented, caramel macchiato was perfected.
Delicious.
A lot changes in 1,000 years, and that's true of this part of the Old Testament. Now, you'll remember from last time that God made a promise to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. This promise covered three things: a nation, a land, and a blessing. God fulfilled the first part of the promise by creating the nation of Israel, which was made up of Abraham's descendants. In the book of Joshua, we see how God fulfilled the second part of his promise. After Moses, God called Joshua to lead the nation of Israel into the promised land. And even though people fought them for this land, God gave them victory. And Joshua 21 sums up this whole time period. So the Lord gave to Israel all the land he had sworn to give their ancestors. And they took possession of it and settled there. So everything looks pretty good for Israel now, right? Well, actually, no. Things are about to get pretty bad for Israel. Although God was blessing Israel, his people were stuck in the sin cycle. In the book called Judges, we see this sin cycle that gets repeated over and over again. It's a good example of how sin works. God helps his people. For example, he gives his people the promised land. But then Israel wanders from God. At different points throughout the Old Testament, they start to worship false gods or idols. Because of their sin, disaster would strike. For example, a foreign army would take them over. Then they would ask God for help. They would cry out to him when other foreign armies were oppressing them. And then God would help them. He would deliver his people. But then the whole sin cycle would repeat itself. And this sin cycle would repeat for generations as God's people would continue to make foolish decisions. Now, when you read Judges, you might be thinking, these people are really dumb. Why didn't they just stop sinning? But when you think about it, we make the same foolish choices. God helps us, he saves us, but we wander from God and do whatever we want. And then we experience the consequences of our sin, so we ask God to help us, and he does. But then we go right back through the sin cycle, just like Israel. Now you might wonder, what was God thinking throughout all of this? Well, God sent prophets to warn the people about their sin. These prophets warned the people what would happen if they refused to turn away from their sins. But for the most part, Israel ignored the prophets and kept on sinning. But that doesn't mean the promise was over. I want to show you what God did with his promise to Abraham through this time. God continued his plan to rescue the world and expanded his promise through King David. Now, God didn't put it on hold. He added to his promise of a nation, a land, and a blessing. He added the promise of a king. We see this in 1 Chronicles 7. I will raise up one of your descendants, one of your sons, and I will make his kingdom strong. I will be his father, and he will be my son. I will confirm him as king over my house and my kingdom for all time, and his throne will be secure forever. God said that one of David's descendants would be the king, but he wasn't just going to be the king of Israel for a brief period of time. This king would be the king of everything forever. Now, I don't want to give away who this king is, but you could probably guess. While the people were stuck in their sin, God was still working to fulfill his promise that he made to Abraham. So, as we consider this large section of the Old Testament, I want you to think about one more thing. Notice that God never abandoned his people. No matter how bad Israel's sin became, God still loved his people and worked to rescue them. This tells us that God isn't going to abandon us either. You can't sin so much that God will stop loving you. Maybe you spent the last few months or even years running away from God. It may not be obvious to the people around you, but you know that you're not honoring God with your life. But understand, God has not given up on you. He wants to rescue you from your sins. He wants you to admit your sin to him and come back to him. God didn't give up on his people in the Old Testament, and he won't give up on you. You can experience his forgiveness today.